What if I told you that medieval England wasn't just knights, castles, and plague? It was a world with ideas and systems that still shape how we live today. In the next few minutes, we're going to cover 5 surprisingly useful things to know about medieval England. Not just the dramatic stuff, but the mechanisms behind how it actually worked and why that matters. First, England was run on local power, not just a king. When people think of medieval England, they imagine a king controlling everything from a throne. But in reality, power was highly local. Most people lived in villages under lords who controlled land, law, and labor. The king mattered, but the day-to-day system depended on local elites: sheriffs, bishops, manor lords, and village officials. Why is this useful to know? Because it explains how large societies can function without modern bureaucracies. They used a chain of delegated authority. If you want a concrete example, think of a manor like a tiny economy. Peasants worked strips of land, paid rent in labor or crops, and local courts settled disputes. Second, land was the real wealth. In medieval England, land wasn't just property. It was power, food, and status all at once. There wasn't a big cash economy for most people, so wealth came from controlling land and the labor tied to it. That's why inheritances, marriages, and wars were so often about land. The mechanism is simple. Land produced surplus. Surplus supported soldiers, servants, and influence, and that influence protected more land. A practical takeaway: if you're studying medieval politics, always ask, who controls the land and who benefits from it? That question explains a lot of medieval conflict in one stroke. Third, the church was the biggest knowledge network. The church in medieval England was not just about religion. It was the main organization connecting local communities to a broader system. Monks and clergy kept records, copied texts, educated elites, and helped administer law and charity. In many places, if you wanted literacy, a record of your land, or a formal marriage, the church was involved. This is useful because it shows how information spreads when institutions are limited. The church worked like a medieval communications network. For example, monasteries often preserved agricultural techniques, medical remedies, and historical records. So if you want to understand why some knowledge survived, the answer is often institutional memory. Fourth, ordinary people were not passive. It's easy to imagine medieval peasants as powerless, but they were constantly making strategic choices. They negotiated rent, moved for better opportunities, formed communal habits, and sometimes resisted authority outright. After major crises like the Black Death, labor became scarce and workers gained leverage. Here's the mechanism. When population drops, labor becomes more valuable. That shifts bargaining power. That's not just history trivia. It's a great example of how demographics shape the economy. If you've ever wondered why wages rose after catastrophe, medieval England gives a real-world case study. Fifth, big events changed everyday life fast. Medieval England can sound slow-moving, but major shocks could transform society quickly. The Black Death, famines, and rebellions didn't just make headlines. They changed prices, labor, land use, and social expectations. A village could look one way in 1340 and very differently by 1400. Why does this matter? Because it shows how fragile systems can be. When enough people die, survive, or move, everything from wages to inheritance patterns shifts. A concrete example: after the Black Death, many landlords tried to freeze wages or bind workers more tightly, which led to tension and eventually unrest. So you can trace a line from a disease outbreak to political conflict. So the 5 most useful things to know about medieval England are: 1. Power was local. 2. Land was the main source of wealth. 3. The church was the knowledge network. 4. Ordinary people had more agency than you might think. And 5. Major shocks could rapidly reshape society. If you understand those 5 things, medieval England stops being a blur of dates and becomes a system you can actually read. And honestly, that's what makes history interesting, not just what happened, but how it worked. 5 most useful things to know about medieval England is just one small part of medieval England. If you're interested, our full free Medieval England course is linked in the description.